Introduction to JSON parsing. Let's start by understanding what JSON parsing is and why it's essential for Power Automate. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a lightweight format used to structure and transport data, especially between web services and applications. In Power Automate, when you retrieve data from a web service or an API, it's often sent in a raw JSON format, essentially a string of plain text. Here's the problem. While JSON is human-readable, it's not directly usable in Power Automate in its raw form. Parsing JSON means converting this text-based data into something Power Automate can interact with, like object variables that store structured data. Once we've parsed the JSON, it becomes dynamic content that we can manipulate, use in conditions, or pass into other actions. Think of JSON parsing as translating a foreign language into one Power Automate can speak. Without parsing, the data would remain in a form we can't work with directly. Why parse JSON in Power Automate? But why exactly do we need to parse JSON? Let's think of a scenario where you're calling an API, maybe from a weather service, or retrieving data from a SharePoint list. The data will almost always be returned in JSON format. JSON can store complex data like lists, user information, task data, and much more. For example, if you get a response with all of a user's details or a set of tasks, this data comes in a structured format. However, without parsing, Power Automate cannot recognize individual components like name, email, or task title. Parsing transforms the JSON string into usable dynamic content. Once parsed, this data can be accessed and manipulated for filtering, conditions, loops, or any other operations in Power Automate. This makes JSON parsing an essential skill, especially if you're working with APIs or any external services that return data in JSON format. Parsing unlocks the true potential of these integrations. Best practice: always assume any API call or service returning data will do so in JSON format. Before working with it, make sure you understand the structure of the returned JSON. Look at the API documentation or inspect the response data to understand the format. Structure of JSON data. Understanding the structure of JSON is crucial for effective parsing. JSON is made up of key-value pairs. Each key, like name or age, is a string, and it is followed by a value, which could be a string, number, array, or even another object. Let's break down an example. JSON. In this example, we have an object containing a user object and a tasks array. The user has keys for name and email, while tasks is an array containing multiple task objects, each with a title and due date. JSON can also handle nested structures, allowing you to store rich, complex data all within one object. Understanding this structure is key to parsing. Each key can be referenced later as dynamic content in Power Automate, but this requires knowing how to access and work with each element correctly, especially when dealing with nested objects and arrays. Best practice: whenever you are working with an API or service that returns JSON data, inspect the structure carefully. Understand how deeply nested the data is and what specific keys you need to work with. This makes it easier to write the correct schema and access data efficiently later in the flow. JSON parsing action in Power Automate. Now that you understand the basics of JSON, let's talk about how to actually parse it in Power Automate. Power Automate provides a dedicated action for this called Parse JSON. Here's the step-by-step process. Add the Parse JSON action. In your flow, after the action that retrieves the JSON, like an HTTP request or SharePoint action, insert the Parse JSON action. Specify the JSON content. The content field will hold the raw JSON data from the previous step. Usually, this is a dynamic value returned from an API or service. Provide the schema. The schema is a blueprint that describes the structure of the JSON data. It tells Power Automate what keys to expect and what types of values, strings, numbers, arrays, are associated with those keys. By defining the schema, you ensure that Power Automate understands the structure of the JSON and can correctly extract each piece of information. Best practice: always use a parse JSON action whenever you're dealing with JSON data, even if the structure is simple. This allows for cleaner, more manageable flows. Also, avoid manually editing complex schemas if possible. Use the built-in tools to auto-generate them from sample data. Generating the JSON schema. You don't need to manually write out the schema every time. Power Automate includes a very useful feature called Generate from Sample that allows you to create a schema automatically. Here's how you do it. Copy a sample JSON response from the service you're working with, either from an API or a previous step in your flow. Paste it into the Generate from Sample box in the Parse JSON action. Power Automate will auto-generate the schema based on the sample you provided. This is a quick and easy way to get the correct schema without needing to manually type it out, and it ensures you don't miss any fields. Best practice: always work with a sample JSON when generating the schema. Make sure the sample represents the full range of potential data. For instance, if some fields might be empty or optional, ensure the sample includes those cases so the schema accounts for every scenario. Accessing parsed JSON data. Once the JSON is parsed, the magic begins. The data is no longer just a string. It is now accessible as dynamic content in your flow. This means that every key in the JSON, such as user.name or task's 0 title, can be referenced and used in subsequent steps. Here's how to use parsed JSON data. When building your flow, look for the parsed values in the Dynamic Content panel. Select and use individual fields, like user.name, wherever you need them, whether you're sending an email, storing values in a SharePoint list, or making a decision in a conditional block. With the data now parsed, you can integrate it easily into various Power Automate actions. Best practice: use dot notation, user.name, to reference nested values. For arrays, remember that indexing starts at 0, task's 0-point title for the first task. Make sure you fully understand the structure of the parsed JSON before using it in complex scenarios. Handling nested JSON structures. When working with nested JSON structures, it's important to understand how to access each layer of data. For example, in our earlier JSON example, you might have a user object that contains another set of key value pairs like name and email. To access user.name, you would use dot notation, user.name. If you're working with an array, like the tasks array in our example, you'll need to reference items using their index. So tasks 0. Title refers to the title of the first task, while tasks 1. Due date refers to the due date of the second task. In cases where you don't know how many items will be in an array, such as tasks or user records, you can use the apply to each action to loop through each item dynamically. Best practice: when accessing arrays in JSON, always consider the possibility of empty arrays or arrays with variable lengths. Use the apply to each loop to process each element safely, without risking errors due to missing data. Best practices for JSON parsing. Let's wrap up with some best practices for working with JSON in Power Automate. Validate your JSON. Before parsing, always validate your JSON using tools like JSON-lint. Even small errors like a missing comma or a misplaced quote can cause the parse JSON action to fail. Use descriptive variable names. Give your parsed data and variables meaningful names. This makes your flows easier to maintain and understand, especially when revisiting them later or collaborating with others. Test with run history. Always check the run history after running your flow. This lets you see the exact output from the parse JSON action and verify that the data was parsed as expected. Keep your JSON simple. Where possible, keep the structure of your JSON as simple and flat as you can. Overly complex, deeply nested JSON can be harder to work with and debug. By following these practices, you'll ensure that your flows are efficient, maintainable, and less prone to errors. Conclusion: you've now completed the theory section on understanding JSON parsing in Power Automate. At this point, you should feel confident in why parsing JSON is so essential and how to implement it effectively in your workflows. Up next, we'll move on to the practical application, where you'll build a flow to parse JSON data yourself.